Welcome to Season 3 of the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. Last year, host Jorden Guth got a crash course in the fundamentals of hi-fi from enthusiasts, journalists, manufacturers, and music industry professionals alike. And those lessons will continue, but this year, Jorden will also get a history lesson from the legends who were there from the giddy-up and who made hi-fi what it is today. So with that out of the way, here's Jorden and this week's guest.
Hello and welcome to the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. Today, we are joined with the founder and CEO of Axiom Audio, the owner of Bryston and more recently Magnum Dynalab, Mr. Ian Colquhoun. Or Ian Colquhoun, if I'm using the Scottish accent right. How did I do?
Did well.
Close?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thanks for having me. It's a great idea.
Ian, I know that we're going to get into your kind of companies and all of that stuff, your time at NRC and all kinds of really cool stuff. To start, though, I want to kind of get some sense of like how you originally got into hi-fi or audio. Do you have a first memory of hi-fi that you could share, or like kind of a picture for people about how you actually came to be interested in high-end audio?
Yes, and it goes back a long, long way. So it started when I was just a little kid, and my father was really into audio, and he was also an engineer. So he would build his own audio equipment. So he built the amplifiers, he built the speakers. Pretty sure he bought the turntable. And so it started then, just sort of, hanging around as a little kid, watching all this happen and thinking about how cool this was. And then, eventually you'd hook it all up and we'd have great audio. So, that was sort of the beginning of it all. And, just a little offshoot story, but it's kind of interesting because my dad was actually an engineer doing hydroelectric dams, and then Atomic Energy of Canada started in sort of the 50s with a little project called Chalk River, and he got involved in that. So he ended up designing nuclear reactors and was with them right through until they finished Pickering. So
no way.
So I grew up around those things and grew up with the building of audio equipment, and also an audio family. I mean, everybody in the family was into it. My mother was an opera fan, so that took a little getting used to. My dad was a classical guy. But my brother was quite a bit older, and so I really got introduced to the whole new music scene, the whole rock and roll folk scene, which then would have been in the 60s, pretty early on. So music was a big part of growing up. And when it came time for me to have my own hi-fi system, which was in high school, the obvious thing to do is I would build it myself. And so I that was the first pair of speakers that I built was when I was in high school. And it turned out that, people liked them. So that's sort of how I ended up starting to sell speakers. It was really that simple. I mean, I had built these speakers and people would come around to parties and stuff and say, oh, well, can you build me a pair? So, my dad had all kinds of workshops around the house. He had electronics one in the basement and a wood shop out in the garage. So, I kind of grew up around all the stuff to make audio as well. And
so you had all the tools and you had the know-how, and then you had the support from your father. So it all kind of came together.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And this building and selling of speakers to people who would come around, I mean, this continued right through when I went to university.
And Axiom was originally founded in like 1980, 1981, close to that.
It was 1980.
1980. Okay, so over 40 years old, which is wild. Congratulations.
Yeah. Doesn't feel like it.
Time flies when you're having fun.
But basically, yeah, I was. I guess it was 20 years old when I started it, and I really just wanted to sort of get out of university and start doing something in the real world. And this was such an obvious thing to do because I was already doing it. And now it was a matter of, okay, well then how do I turn this thing into a real business? So I kind of thought, well, in university, I actually studied philosophy and economics. So sounds like an odd combo.
That is exactly what I did. I went to Carleton University and I have a degree in economics and a minor in philosophy. That's amazing. I love it.
Well, I don't know. Hopefully you'll get to speak with Martin Steck because he has the same thing.
Oh, no way.
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome.
So Martin and I, of course, spent years just chatting about philosophy and economics, as well as loudspeaker design, of course.
They seem to be connected in some way.
Yes, they do. Well, let's face it, philosophy and economics is really broad knowledge stuff. And, it's the study of how to think and how the world works. So it's a nice combination when you think about it that way.
Yeah. Honestly, when it comes to the kind of combination there, and I think it actually relates really well with speakers, with hi-fi in general, you have the analytical side of things, but then you also have the metaphysical side or the experiential side that is not lesser or greater than, but complements the analytics. So I think there's a really good tie-in between philosophy, economics, and speakers. So that's a great combination you got there. So, and maybe actually going down that path a little bit further, you founded Axiom in 1980. You were just getting out of university. I guess by founding it, really, that just means you started claiming it on tax expenses and your income statements and stuff like that. What else did that mean when you say you founded Axiom, more than what you were doing previously, just selling the speakers directly to people?
Really, the change was it was a decision to turn this into a real business as opposed to something that was really just a sideline thing to, make extra money. So that was really it. And what I ended up doing is I thought, well, the first thing I better do is learn how this industry works. So I went to work for a company in Toronto called Fairview Electronics and Sound Advice. These were two different levels of retail stores, both owned by George Burt, but quite famous in the marketplace. So I went to work there, and I was there for about a year or so. Made a lot of contacts, learned how the whole industry sort of works, became good friends with George Burt. In fact, Fairview Electronics was the first Axiom dealer.
Oh, cool.
So then there was this sort of second break of it, like, okay, now it's time to leave the world of Fairview and Sound Advice and start actually going out and selling product to various dealers. So Fairview was the first, and then got a sort of a handful of dealers around Ontario fairly quickly. And it's still the same location, the factory in Dwight. Where
from 1980, it's still the same factory?
Yes.
Of course, it's been upgraded and expanded, I'm assuming.
Is now the front office, but there's been a lot of additions to this factory over the decades. So, it started out as, really, really just a little, almost, large garage, you might say. But, at that time, too, I went and bought at auction and things like this, because, of course, I didn't have any money. Some real equipment for making loudspeakers. Back then, of course, if you had a V-groover and a pin router, you had some good equipment for making speakers. So that all happened probably in 1981. And I rented that building originally. I bought it in 86 and then started expanding it in 1990 and then expanded it dramatically from there on. So but you can still see the little front part that is the offices, was the original building.
That's amazing. And so around that time, like early 1980s, you somehow found out about the NRC.
Yes.
In Ottawa. So for people that don't know, where you are in Dwight, it's probably about maybe 4 or 5 hours from Ottawa, maybe a little bit more.
A little bit less, actually. Little bit less? Around 3.5, that sort of area.
Okay. So how does a freshly finished university student, granted you're in the hi-fi space, you have some industry knowledge working at some of the local shops and that, how do you hear about the NRC? How does that come up on your radar?
Well, that was an interesting meeting, and the way it all happened. It really started where once I had this sort of handful of dealers around Ontario, I thought, well, maybe I'll run an ad in one of the audio magazines, and maybe even get a product reviewed. So I set up a meeting with Sound Canada, and at the time, the editor of Sound Canada magazine was Alan Loft. So met with Alan Loft, and he explained to me that this is where they were testing their speakers for review at the NRC, and that started to go through what Floyd Toole was doing up there, and said, you really need to go there and meet this guy. So I did. I mean, I think I went the next day. I was just kind of intrigued and excited by this. It's like, what? This is going on? And went up to NRC and met with Floyd. And I don't know if you've ever met Floyd. There's something really special about this guy. I mean, he's just a wonderful person. And I think anyone who's met him would agree with me on that. So obviously we got along really well, and he walked me through everything that was going on up there. And I'm just completely blown away by this, and realized that basically I was going to have to unlearn everything I had learned. Like, it was all useless, except the basics about how a crossover works and drivers and stuff like that. But as far as you have to remember, prior to, certainly in the 1970s and maybe even prior to Floyd putting out Turning Opinion into Fact, most people thought that speakers were built for particular types of music. So, and they all had names. You had an East Coast sound, a West Coast sound, a British sound. They all these sounds. Yeah. So if you were a rock and roll person, you bought this kind of speaker, and if you were a jazz person, you'd get that, and this sort of thing, right? This is how, you'd think we were making wine or something. But that was the belief. That was the belief that it actually worked that way. And of course, when I got to NRC and we were going through everything that they were doing up there, it was, by that point in time, they knew for sure that this is not how it worked. Floyd knew this for sure. And that there was a science here, and if you followed it, you would win a controlled double-blind listen test. So it's just like, I'm going to have to learn this science. I have to learn it like right now. And at the time, I think it was really only Floyd and Paul Barton Paul Barton had been using the whole NRC laboratory and had known Floyd for quite a few years before I got there. And then, right around the same time as me, that's when Martin Steck from Paradigm came along, and Ian Paisley from Paisley Research, which later became Audio Products International, and he ended up heading the engineering for them. So the three of us all arrived at the same time. Paul was already there. I don't know exactly what their experiences were, if it was similar to mine, but it's quite likely. So I ditched it all. Everything I had ever thought I knew had to be ditched. And
now, was that because when you got there, did you bring a set of your speakers that you were building, and did you test them right away? Was that kind of the first thing you did?
Pretty much, yes.
How did they hold up? Not well, or not the way that you expected?
ran some measurements in the chamber, and I think Floyd made the comment that, well, they're pretty well balanced. And I think he was being very gracious about that, probably really thinking, oh my God. So that changed right away. The NRC was something that was available to rent in those days. Well, still is today. So you could rent the laboratory. And I booked it right away. I booked it that day for probably like the next week, and would have booked a couple of days in. And really, at the time, there were only 2 models in the Axiom line. And they, over the course of the next few weeks, they changed dramatically. I basically now had access to all this equipment. I had access to Floyd's knowledge, and the product quality, of course, just shot up, and there's no looking back.
So when you make those adjustments and you start implementing them, and let's say you bring them back to your dealers, the new models, the new generations, was there immediate feedback that people heard the difference? Or was there like an element that you still had to educate people on why the changes were made?
No, it was just immediate. There was just no question about it. It was like, wow, this is a fantastic upgrade to the 2 models. And then we did go on from there and get our review in Sound Canada magazine. But look, it was immediately obvious. It made a big difference.
And did you have was there a naming convention for the sound? We were talking about the East Coast sound and the British sound and all of that. Did you come back with like, this is the Axiom sound, or was this like outside of sound, this was just the way speakers should be?
Yeah. Oddly enough, we got labeled as the Canadian sound.
Okay. That's fair.
Which makes sense. And of course, there were obvious similarities between all of these products, the API products, which later on became Energy and Mirage and Paradigm and PSB and Axiom. We were all using the same laboratory to do the designs, and we were all getting our knowledge from the same guy. So there were a lot of similarities, and it's interesting because technically we would have all been competitors, but I don't think that anyone really, worried about that too much, because we were all, pretty small fledgling companies. And we understood that if we were going to become decent sized companies, it was the Americans and the British that we were going to have to displace. Those were all the big brands. So we kind of like this idea of the Canadian sound, and it gave us the ability to really go up against these big brands. And, Floyd gave us the ability to go up against these big brands. So not only could we go up against them, but we could absolutely beat them. And so now we had better products. So I think all of us expanded pretty dramatically through the 80s. I know it was a big time for Axiom, and I know it was for Paradigm as well. So, and obviously API became at one point certainly the biggest in Canada, and maybe I believe about the 4th biggest loudspeaker company in the world. So they did great. So yeah, we were technically competitors, but we really knew that this whole idea of us being put in the pot and called the Canadian sound was actually a really, really good thing.
Well, I mean, the fact that the research that Floyd has done, or that I'm going to say the entirety of NRC, because I know there was more people involved there, but Floyd really spearheaded it. But that is still used in a huge amount of the speakers that are designed today. That's like essentially a foundation for most of what we have as modern audio.
Maybe. I view it a little bit differently, because if you look at the whole project that, made the Canadian audio business, basically, it started and it ended with a person, and that person was Floyd Toole. So the NRC basically provided the bricks, the mortar, and the nuts and the bolts and this sort of thing. But it really started with Floyd, and it really kind of ended in, I guess it was around 1992 when he went to Harman. So the facility was still available to rent, and we rented it for a while. I think everybody did for a while, but then we all started to build our own laboratories. So, Audio Products International, Paradigm, myself, we all went out and bought anechoic chambers and put them in our own facilities. And then that kind of left Paul Barton alone at the NRC. So he sort of turned the NRC into his laboratory, and it's still available to rent. I know that Soundstage uses it for doing speaker testing, which is fantastic. I mean, I think that is the right way to do it. And I would imagine there's still some other companies using the place. But if you really look at the whole project, if you really look at it as the research project, it really started and ended with Floyd Toole.
To your point, I actually met Paul Barton at the NRC. I think it's M37 is the building with Doug. He was still testing speakers. He still makes the drive down from Toronto, outside of Toronto, to the NRC to use the facility. So maybe describe the vibe of this place a little bit more, because what I really find fascinating is this idea that you guys are all competitors, but you realize that you're not really competing with each other as much as you're competing with the external companies. Like, were you bouncing ideas off of one another, or was there some amount of like secrecy, or was there some amount of like peer review happening between the different companies there?
I think that peer review might be the proper phrase around it. We did actually discuss things amongst ourselves. Certainly Ian Paisley and Martin and myself discussed a lot of things, and same with Paul. It's just that I was, I ended up being almost really friends with Martin, and to a lesser degree Ian. But Ian Paisley designed the Axiom drivers, and Audio Products International made those drivers for us for years. So it was pretty close knit. And Martin and I would talk about a lot of things around speaker design. So we weren't really concerned about that side of things, in that we were all getting the knowledge from Floyd. So what difference does it make?
Yeah.
Either we could talk to each other directly about it, or we could talk with Floyd, and Floyd will talk to somebody. You know what I mean? You might as well just talk amongst yourselves. So yeah, there was a fair amount of collaboration. And I think that really one of the reasons that could work so well at that time is that Floyd was driving the bus. So it wasn't like we were really inventing much of anything. He was inventing everything. We were just the ones turning that into a practical reality, which really, really helped for the project, because now we had real companies that could build real samples and try them put them through the NRC phases. But, as how much of our own ideas were part of what we were doing. I mean, we certainly had our own ideas, and they were certainly getting put in there, but the vast majority of it was coming through the group and Floyd, who was, really the one who figured all this out. He's the one who wrote all the papers about it that went into the Audio Engineering Society journals. And, we all had our unique stuff. We had a rear firing subwoofer right back at the beginning. I mean, one of the original 2 Axiom models had a rear firing sub. So, that was something other people weren't doing, things like that. Paul had a lot of things he was doing in his drivers that we weren't doing. So we weren't trying to really copy each other necessarily. But the core of what happens was what I call the family of amplitude response curves, and how that works and how that relates to the listening experience. We were all in that together.
I think that's so cool. Basically, the idea of Dr. Floyd giving the theory and then you guys putting it into practice, making it applicable into an actual product.
Yes, worked really well. And, we would, a lot of these blind listen tests, we'd have a bunch of our own products in there, just with different sort of ways of, different responses, usually in the off axis. I mean, we really knew at that point in time that, the on axis and was really the key. You had to have a good on axis, but you couldn't win a listening test with just a great on axis response and ignore all the rest of them. You would not win. You would lose. So really how that family of curves worked and what dominated what in this whole family of measurements that we would take. We were, this was getting figured out during this time.
So I think this is a good place to kind of take a quick little break for our listeners. And then when we come back, I'm curious to learn more about Axiom and kind of more how you took those theories and applied it into actual products and what that's meant for Axiom and the other brands that you now own in the Canadian hi-fi space and how those products get put out into the world. So we will be right back.
All right. Sounds perfect.
Welcome back. We are still here with Ian Colquhoun. And before the break, we were talking about the kind of involvement that Axiom and Ian had at NRC with the other major players in the Canadian hi-fi space in the 80s and a little bit into the 90s. I guess the next kind of progression there is Dr. Floyd Toole left the NRC and you built your own anechoic chamber. Is that correct? Or did you build the anechoic chamber before leaving the NRC, or how did that all play?
It was a little bit later. I made the trip to Ottawa for a number of years and realized that there was no point in really making that trip any longer because Floyd wasn't there. So one day I just took the phone number off the nameplate on the anechoic chamber at the NRC and called the company and said, I need one of these. So I bought one, and
they built you a almost 1-for-1 replica of the NRC one. Is that correct?
They built the NRC one, and I said, I'll take the same model.
Oh, that is awesome.
So, and they put it all together and tested it and everything else. So it's, because it's really, they're really quite a particular field. I don't think you could really kind of make one on your own. You need to be without any reflections anywhere in the audio band.
And when you started that up, so now you have the anechoic chamber, I'm assuming, because I know that Axiom started being an OEM for other manufacturers, other companies as well. Did you have all of this manufacturing capability in the anechoic chamber and you started inviting other companies in to manufacture their products, or did they reach out to you, or how did that kind of dynamic start to happen?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We did a lot of that. That was all in the 90s. And really in the early 90s, I wanted to really modernize the factory and start getting into CNC equipment, which was pretty early in the woodworking industry then. I mean, they'd been around in the automotive industry for probably 20 years by then. But as far as the woodworking industry went, it was pretty new to be able to buy CNC woodworking equipment. So I decided that in order to do this, I'd have to expand the factory quite a bit, both in space and order a bunch of very expensive equipment to be able to make that shift. And it was just kind of a practical thing to do. I knew other people who didn't have factories and wanted to get their product made. So it was kind of like okay, well, if I do this, we can make your product. How does that sound? And that sounds good. So let's do it. And it turned into quite a business through the 90s. We were building a lot of different products and basically had tractor trailers that would sit at the back doors of the Axiom factory, and they were all destined for different Circuit City warehouses in the United States. So, and they'd have multiple brands on them. So it was done by warehouse, not by brand. But it really allowed me to expand the factory just dramatically through that period of time. And then by the early aughts, that was kind of winding down. That sort of business was moving to China. And we started to really return the focus at that point to the brand itself. And it was more of a question of, okay, well, we've got this wonderful factory and we've just gone through this period where we were able to sort of pay for it all doing OEM work. So now we're going to focus more on the brand and more on expanding the laboratory and expanding what we do with loudspeakers and even electronics. So at that time, this is in the early aughts. I was always intrigued with this idea of using digital signal processing in a speaker. It's something that was played around with might be a mild term for it. They dug into it pretty deeply at NRC in the early 90s. And it didn't have a real practical application then because the DSPs were you had to use multiple very expensive DSPs to get it to do anything. Well, by the time we got to the end of the 90s, that had changed. And there were DSPs on the market that were powerful enough to do something like control a subwoofer, which is where we started with this.
Yeah.
So we made the branch out into that, and then I bought a whole pile of equipment for designing and testing electronics. That's where that started. And then it was a gentleman by the name of Steve Dove who actually wrote all the code for the DSPs for us in the beginning.
Okay.
But it was really, you really had to control the amount of memory because the DSPs were still pretty limited. And he wrote all of this code in assembly language. It was really quite amazing. But by 2004, we brought a DSP controlled subwoofer to the marketplace. That was pretty much, I don't know who was first, but could have been us.
One of the first. If not the first.
If not the first, right? So that really, then we were into electronics because now, we had to design and build these DSP boards and design and build subwoofer amplifiers to go with them. And that was the beginning of electronics for us. So it was a bit of a change. We didn't really do much other than just subwoofers and subwoofer amplifiers for quite a few years. But I guess probably around 2006 or so, I started playing around with using DSPs for broadband speaker design.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, no products really came to market out of that. It was done from purely a research point of view because we had continued on. I think all of us did after Floyd left and we built our own laboratories. We all continued on working with the whole concept of the family of amplitude response curves and what could make a better sounding loudspeaker. I mean, we had built double blind listen test room, mirrored it again pretty much off of what they had at the NRC. We had much more fancy switchers than they had at the NRC. So we have switchers that can just switch a crossover, for example, and you don't have to have two pairs of speakers or two speakers if you're doing it in mono. In the listen test, you can literally just switch from one crossover to another crossover through the same pair of speakers. And this is good because there's something called position error in these double blind tests that cause you to have to switch the position and repeat the test to verify the results, especially if the two things that you're going up against are really close to each other. So then you have to get rid of the position error. I mean, it's not so bad that if something is just horrible and something's really good, switching its position is not going to fix that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and we could switch DSP code with a switcher, and obviously line level switching, high level switching. So we got into building a lot of these switches, and it was actually Tom Cumberland who did all of the electronics designs and the DSPs and the subwoofer amps for us through those years. So in 2006, the DSPs were now powerful enough that we could play around with broadband loudspeakers. We didn't take it to market. I mean, if you're going to use a DSP, you're going to basically end up with an active loudspeaker. So you're going to need an amplifier channel for each driver set.
Yeah.
This had been tried many times in the market and flopped flat in its face every single time. So I wasn't really interested in going down that road and through that pain. But it was excellent for doing tests on the family of curves just for our own research purposes, because you could do so much more with a DSP. And then you could always, copy that pretty darn close analog later, but to try all of these things, just one analog crossover to another, that was a lot of work. We're doing it with a DSP. Well, it was still a lot of work, but it was a lot easier and a lot more accurate. So now we actually do have fully active DSP controlled loudspeakers in the marketplace. That came around much later. So,
and what I find interesting about that is there's some brands that are very particular about active or analog, and they kind of stick one way or another. I find it fascinating that you were using the DSP and the kind of digital technology to effectively design the analog technology.
Correct.
Do you still manufacture both analog and digital speakers? You have fully active speakers like the Axiom Air, the kind of portable one, and some of the other ones, and you still have full analog speakers.
Yes. In fact, most of the products we sell are full analog.
So do you foresee that ever changing? Like, do you foresee active speakers reaching a point of acceptance where they finally say, yeah, we're going to go full active. We're not going to deal with separate components or anything like that. We're going to bring it all in-house so that the manufacturer can control the sound from start to finish?
That would be a resounding yes.
Interesting.
We are on a mission to get active out there. So all of the latest models that we've really just started to introduce in the past sort of probably 6 months now come with this little sort of drawer. So I don't know if you're familiar with sort of, single amp, bi-amp, and you buy the speakers, and it's got these bridging bars between the two binding posts. And if you want to bi-amp it, you take the bridging bars out and all this sort of thing. So what we have now is we have these doors that you plug in. So if you want to just single amp it, you put in the single amp door. If you want to bi-amp it, you put in the bi-amp door. Tri-amp it, you put in the tri-amp door. And if you want to go fully active, you put in the active door.
That is so cool.
So now people don't have to try and make this decision when they're first buying the loudspeakers. It's like, oh, well, here, why don't you go active and buy 6 channels of amplification while you're at it?
That is so cool. I don't know that I've actually heard of other companies that kind of that have taken that approach. That's really neat.
We are the first with this for sure. This is an Axiom invention.
And was that's not on like the bookshelf speakers? That's on the bigger towers?
It's on every single model.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. Now it hasn't been implemented in every model, but by the time we're done, which will probably be next summer, it will be on every single model.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
So, and maybe let's take a moment to kind of change directions a little bit and talk about some of the products that Axiom has, because there's some really interesting things. Like you're just talking about those doors and the modules to kind of convert it from a fully analog system. into a fully active system. There's also something else that when I was mentioning that I was going to be speaking to you, it got brought up that you also have a really interesting design with this twin tweeter design that's not common among other speaker manufacturers.
No, in fact, it's quite rare. I think is Dynaudio doing it? I think so. But we were definitely the first to do that. And it's actually a little bit controversial, to tell you the truth, and it's where you definitely want to have an anechoic chamber and access to double-blind listen testing, because really what ends up happening is, I don't know if you're familiar with what a comb filter is, but it's essentially all it is two identical frequencies arriving at the microphone at a different time. So it causes a cancellation when that happens, because time is phase. So now you've created a phase cancellation. So inevitably, if you look at just the measurements, it's sort of like, well, is that going to really work? We were quite motivated to do it because the advantages are huge when you start to look at what is the thing that is always controlling the dynamic range of a loudspeaker. Well, you can keep adding drivers and mid-ranges and this sort of thing and eliminate them out of the equation. Plus, they're better at handling power anyway.
Yeah.
Not getting into the fact about bass requires that. But the tweeter becomes the limiting factor in your dynamics. And at some point, tweeters, it's hard to sort of make them more robust. We do everything we can. There's a whole nother side of research that we did starting again back in the late 90s, probably even the mid 90s, which is when we built our power test room, or the torture chamber, as we call it. And we got into how far can we push something and not have it blow up or go into distortion from some form of clipping or even compression. What would happen when it would hit compression? Would it just stop getting louder, or would it start to crap out, or would it just blow up? And we had there's just an enormous amplifier in there to do this, because as we progressed through it and got further and further down the road, we kept needing more and more and more power to get to the limitation of the loudspeaker. So really interesting piece of work. And what grew out of that was us making our own drivers. So prior to that time, we purchased the drivers from Audio Products International. And then later on, Martin Steck got into the driver game, and we were buying them from him. So that's where we started making our own, because now we needed to really control the driver design, and not just the design, but the actual methods of manufacturing it to be able to take its power handling up further and further and further. And we were doing this with tweeters, mids, drivers, everything, every component. And at some point where you really run into the wall is, as much as you can do to that tweeter, you've just run into its absolute physical limits.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, okay, well, how do we push this one even higher? So this is what this was born out of. It was born out of this side of the experimentation of loudspeaker design, which is how to get it to survive in the real world. But beyond that, be able to play dynamics and deliver dynamics at loud levels. Because, once you've kind of got the psychoacoustical side of it done, once you've, accomplished the fact that, you can win the listen test, or at least tie the best, then, where do you go from here? Well, this was a whole field that nobody was really touching, and we wanted to touch it. So we started getting into it. Also led into all kinds of experiments around distortion and things like that. But anyway, out of this came the idea that the best way to deal with this was to simply use more than one tweeter. So it would solve everything if we made that move. And then it was sort of like, well, we know that's going to cause cancellation. So then the question became, does it matter? I mean, we all knew that we live with foam filtering Unless you're listening to your system in mono, you are living with comb filters.
Yeah.
All stereo systems are full of it. You've got two sources of things playing essentially the same thing. The right and left channel, most of it is in mono, actually. So those frequencies arrive at your listening chair at a different time, and that gives you a comb filter. So, and it happens, we measured this in the chamber. It's like, well, how far off center do you have to be before this starts to really affect things in the audio band? And the answer turned out to be 2 inches.
Oh, wow.
So
much
2
closer
inches,
than I would have
you're
guessed.
seeing it, creep down from the top of the audio band down further and further as you get further away from the center. So it's like, okay, well, we're all living with this thing now. So what if we, what
Embrace
and we
it.
know we prefer stereo. And we even decided that the first thing to do was maybe prove that in a double blind listen test. So what we did is we took a mono signal, and so we had 3 loudspeakers, 1 in the middle and 2 out to the outside, like a stereo system. And we set it all at equal level, and the switcher went from the stereo pair to the one mono in the center. The idea was, okay, well, what would win that? Like I say, the source was mono, so there wasn't like you got spaciousness out of the stereo pair that wasn't available to the mono. And the stereo pair won the listen test, hands down. So then we started to march the speakers closer and closer and closer to the middle speaker, and kept redoing the test and redoing the test. And eventually we got to the point where they were basically all 3 in a row. So you had the middle one and the 2 outside ones, and now it was essentially a tie. At that point, they all scored the same. And yet we knew that the 2 on the outside, unless you had some sort of vice to put your head in, was giving you a comb filter. And the mono one would not have been doing that. So it was like, okay, it sounds like this might be what we refer to as a measurement artifact. And trust me, there's lots of those in loudspeaker design. But the reason for that is that a microphone is not 2 ears and a brain.
Sure.
And,
yeah.
Floyd has done a lot of research into this and basically says the same thing. I think I got that phrase from him, that a microphone is not 2 ears and a brain. So you have to realize that we don't actually have a way to measure the sound as it exists in our brain. We can only measure it with this dumb measuring instrument called a microphone. And then from that, we have to determine that given that suite of measurements that we take with a microphone, how do we turn that into something that 2 ears and a brain likes? They say, yes, I prefer that, right? And they really do. I mean, I think Sean Olive did the stats on it, and I believe it's 86% of people will agree in averaged in a listening test. So, and that proves out pretty much with our numbers too. I mean, you can do these tests and you might have the odd outlier here and there, but essentially everyone agrees on what sounds better. So we had to rely heavily on basically the empirical evidence to be able to go down this road and say, yes, we're getting enormous benefit in dynamics. And what we're sacrificing, essentially, we could prove was a measurement artifact.
A non-issue for the majority of people.
For anybody. You'd have to be missing your 2 ears and a brain, I guess.
There's some people.
So we went down that road, and we always kept models in the line that didn't have the dual tweeters, because there's certainly a lot of people who have seen a comb filter in a measurement and will go, oh boy, can't have that in my system. I mean, I was talking to Alan Loft about this, and a friend of his actually will not buy stereo. He has a mono system today.
Oh, that's dedication right there.
That is dedication to avoiding the comb filter.
That is, well.
But, then you get into the reflections, and okay, maybe even that's out the window.
Yeah. I mean, and you kind of already mentioned it, but it's this idea that speaker design is bound by physics, right? So you can get as perfect as you can get, but there is always going to be some variance, and there's always going to be some trade-offs in terms of what you're after. I think, well, I mean, you already mentioned it, right? Like the speakers that are accurate, it's cool if they're accurate, but if they don't provide accuracy in the dynamics that somebody's actually listening to, then it doesn't really matter.
No, it doesn't. And, we were servicing very well people who, were in smaller rooms, say even normal sized rooms, weren't wild partiers. But anybody who had, a huge space to fill or, just really wanted to turn it up, which is a lot of people that are into audio want to listen to it pretty loud. Well, if you want to listen to it loud in a large space, you need a different, we need to be able to supply that to you, and it's going to have to play a lot louder and remain dynamic. So this was it, right? This was the answer. So it's like, well, we're not going to let a measurement artifact get in the way of putting something out there in the market that just works better.
So when you're talking about the kind of research and kind of getting it dialed in the anechoic chamber and in theory and all that, to your point, there's then this element of, okay, well, we need to have it dynamic. We need to have it in the room sounding good. So how does that step happen? How do you get something that is theoretically good, but then you're able to apply it consistently throughout a range of products, every single one, and kind of make it viable for somebody's room that might not be ideally set up, for instance?
Yeah. Well, that's actually a two-part question because there's two sides to the consistency. One of the biggest problems in audio, rarely talked about, is the consistency in manufacturing of one loudspeaker to the next. Are the drivers actually all measuring the same? I mean, crossovers tend to be very consistent in their nature, but the drivers are not consistent, especially when you're talking about tweeters. So this was another part that we got into as we started to make our own drivers. We started to also, really get into, how could we bring some technology and even things as basic as really good jigs into the production of our drivers to try and get the consistency so that every single one of them measured the way the original one measured when we designed it. And we ended up going down this road in depth. We bought this box from Listening that would actually allow us to measure every single driver that we manufactured, and it would give us kind of 4 parameters, and it would give us a pass fail based on the parameters that we would put into it. So it would do an amplitude response, an impedance sweep, rub and buzz. And these things, then we knew that the drivers were consistent. And then at the end of it all, we built, it's not an anechoic chamber, but I guess you'd call it a quiet room that sits right on the assembly line and has these automated doors on it that lift up so the product can roll in automatically and then stop right at an eye so that its relation to the microphone is always the same. And then we were to repeat that test in there and make sure that the finished product was exactly the same as what the original design was. So that's one side of consistency. And I can tell you, it's actually a big problem in the industry. It really is. And it's not easy to fix. So the other one about consistency is, okay, now you take this very consistently built product and you stick it in some sort of a room, and what do you get? Right?
Yeah.
And, you'll see lots of people who play around with where they put stuff in the room and everything else to kind of get the best performance in their room. And this is all very legitimate things to do. It's we're getting back to the position error, which we're, really only just exchanging something by, one for the other. They are already right beside each other, and we can get a measurable empirical difference. So, what do you do in the room? And I think that one of the big bigger confusions is that, somehow you can measure a room response and know what is right for your room from that response. And it doesn't really work that way. I suppose it does if you looked at, below the 300 hertz area, but it doesn't actually work that way. You can't really, if you're starting with a good speaker, you're not going to be able to improve it by changing its amplitude response through some sort of, algorithm that's built into your receiver that's going to literally change the amplitude of a perfectly good product because your room response said something. Your room response, of course, is really, really includes everything. It includes all the first reflections, the later reflections. It's, and essentially, if you look at a room response, it looks an awful lot like the total radiated sound power, which you measure in an anechoic chamber. So above 300 hertz. So you don't really want to be playing with that in your room, but you really do want to play around with it under 300 hertz. And you can do that just by moving the speakers around. You can do it by using one of these algorithms that will allow you to at least bring down the humps. It's pretty hard to get rid of a cancellation. More amplitude also increases the cancellation. And of course, at some point, you're just going to waste all your amplifier power trying to get rid of a cancellation. So you can play that game a little bit, but not too much. Ultimately, the best answer is to distribute 4 subwoofers around the room. That will give you a very, very nice looking response. And then you can apply a bit of correction to that. And boy, you're going to have a great sounding room that way. And there's been lots of experimentation on this. Harman did in-depth research into it. It's great stuff, what they did. And we played around with it ourselves. Andrew Welker did a bunch of tests in all these various rooms and dragging 4 subwoofers around with them just to sort of see, because we wanted to really kind of know for ourselves, okay, well, what happens if you put it at the corners? What happens if you put it, midway, front and back, on each wall, this sort of thing. And L-shaped rooms. What do you do in that room? Where do you put your 4 subs, right? We wanted to be able to kind of see what happened. So we did a fair amount of research on it ourselves. But like I say, the stuff that Harman did is excellent. And so that's really, it's really a situation where you don't want to try and fix your room with the loudspeaker. You're better off to maybe fix the room if it's a little bit too echoey for you. Hang up some drapes or throw down a carpet, or if it's a little too dead for you, then maybe take down, so open up the drapes.
Yeah.
We live in a reflective world. If you ever listen to loudspeakers in an anechoic chamber, it's a horrible experience. And, we're trying to replicate what we are used to hearing. And nobody is used to listening to anything in an anechoic chamber. So we are used to reverberant environments. We like them. If you look at most of the really great concert halls, they're very reverberant places. And our 2 ears and a brain likes this thing. They're full of comb filters, by the way, too. But it's just not something that you can fix with an algorithm. Look, if your speakers are bad, you're probably going to make them sound better doing this. But you would have to have a improperly designed loudspeaker from the beginning for something like that to have an effect, much out of the omnidirectional frequency.
Interesting. And with that in mind, do you see any, would there be a resurgence in NRC in terms of research or something, like a topic or a technology or a thought process that you can imagine more research being done on to do another leap like we had in the early 90s at the NRC?
Well, there certainly is. You just have to ask Floyd when he's coming out of retirement.
Fair enough. Oh, that's awesome.
He's right there now.
I mean, he's down the street at this point.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll take that as a way to kind of cap this off, and I'll give you the rest of your afternoon back, so we don't take up too much more of your time.
Yeah, there is one more topic I wanted to cover.
Oh, hit me up. Yeah, let's hear it.
Yeah, and this is the topic of omnidirectional loudspeakers.
Omnidirectional, interesting. Okay. So, does Axiom have omnidirectional speakers at the moment?
We do. We have 3 towers that are omnidirectional.
Oh,
so it's very interesting stuff. I mean, what really happened is back in 2010, this was so Audio Products International had actually closed, and Ian Paisley sort of semi-retired, but his main engineer was Andrew Welker, and Andrew Welker, is an electrical engineer, and he's been in audio. His father had an audio shop. He's been in audio forever. Grew up with it. Sounds like we all did. And then he got to API and got to work with Ian Paisley for 12 years. But he also headed up a brand at API called Mirage, and Mirage was all about omnidirectional. So frankly, when Andrew arrived, Axiom now had probably, I think I can say this very safely, the most knowledgeable person in the world on omnidirectional speakers. And I had, virtually no experience with them. I never really designed one or even thought too much about the concept. But as you can imagine, when Andrew arrived, I mean, we spent a lot of time just chatting about audio, and we got into this thing about omnidirectionals, and Andrew was explaining kind of where the advantages were and where the disadvantages were. And, one of the things he brought up is that, inevitably one of the problems with omnidirectional is what happens at the 90, where you are getting basically a cancellation between the front and the rear driver set, which would normally be the same drivers getting the same information. Sometimes in phase, sometimes out of phase. But so, of course, Mr. DSP says, well, what if we used a DSP to fix the 90, to get rid of that problem? And, there might be some very creative ways that we can actually do that. And if we can't eliminate it, at least we can minimize it dramatically. And so down the road we went in playing around with omnidirectional speakers. And of course, I absolutely love designing omnidirectional speakers now. So I went from knowing nothing in 2009 to, really learning how it works and how it's done. And I had the premier expert in the world there to help me with that. So yeah, now we have, and of course, our latest omnidirectional is called the LFR 1100 Active. And it is a fully active loudspeaker. It takes 5 channels of amplification per speaker to drive it. So it's completely controlled by a DSP. It is absolutely amazing. There are actual things that happen in the family of amplitude response curves that you have to treat differently for omnidirectionals than straight front firing speakers. Otherwise, they won't win a listen test. The concept is exactly the same, but there are certain things you have to do that makes their family of curves look a little bit different. Because, of course, now you have control over the total radiated sound power. I mean, you do in a front firing one too, just through the crossover and the driver design and things like that. But now you have total control over it because your driver's front and back. So it's really, really interesting stuff, and it works great. And the whole idea was to get that big sound that you can get from an Omni, but not lose the detailed image. And there's another great thing about these Omnis is that the center image is usually something that falls apart when you sort of get right of the right speaker or left of the left speaker. But in an omnidirectional, that doesn't happen. It's as one reviewer pointed out in his review, it's like those pictures where it doesn't matter where you go in a room. It looks like the eyeballs are staring straight at you.
Yeah.
So Very interesting stuff. And we have lots more plans for more omnidirectional stuff going forward with the Axiom line of product. But it's interesting. It's interesting.
Yeah, I'm looking at them right now, and they just look so cool as well.
Yes.
It's not something that I've seen in too many speakers out there, if any, that kind of setup.
Yeah, it's pretty rare. And since, there's certainly been a number of companies through the years, and a number right now that are doing omnidirectional. I don't know of any that are doing it and controlling the whole thing with a digital signal processor to kind of get around that problem of the cancellation at the 90, which smears the center images, as Andrew put it.
So there is still more research that can be done.
Oh, we've never stopped.
There is still a lot of stuff.
We've never stopped. We're still doing it now. It continues. Continues to this day. The torture testing, we even erected a long time ago now. We erected a 100-foot tower out in the backyard for the purpose of being able to measure frequencies below 80 hertz, because the anechoic chamber is only accurate down to 80 hertz. So on our 100-foot tower, we can get down to kind of like 12 hertz with a 4 pi measurement, basically an anechoic measurement.
No way. So you're mounting the speaker on the top of the tower and then doing the measurements from there?
Yeah, it's kind of cool. It sits on this sort of, just a frame, so it's open. You sit the speaker on that, and it's pointing up, and the microphone is hanging above it, 2 meters above it. And then it's got a whole series of cables and everything else. And we hook that up to the golf cart and sort of drive the golf cart across the yard, and the speaker goes up the tower.
That is so cool.
You have to pick your days. You want it to be, not a nice temperature, no wind, this sort of thing.
Yeah, no clouds in the sky, no rain halfway through the session and having to quickly get something down.
Right, exactly. And then once every single model goes through this tower measurement, and then what it allows us to do is write a correction curve for the chamber that is model specific, so that we know when we're measuring it below 80 hertz, it actually is the right measurement. So we've kind of faked out the chamber to give us the right information below 80. And
that is so cool. That is something that I would love to see in real life.
Yeah, and this
I feel like we need to make a trip up that way. Floyd and Renee used to rent a crane and put a speaker up there to get a 4 pi measurement, and then write a correction curve for the chamber. And the only problem with that was it worked pretty well, but this is in fact model specific. So they sort of had a generic correction, which was certainly way better than no correction. But we ended up saying, oh no, that's not good enough. We need to drill this down model by model. So everything goes up the tower and gets measured, and then a correction curve written for it. So that's kind of a caveat, but the research goes on, and I don't see it stopping anytime. I mean, we've got, we now have, obviously Andrew, myself, we're into it, and we've got some of the younger guys who are now getting in very, very interested in this stuff. So it'll just keep going. That is very cool. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. There is a final question we like asking guests that come on the show. And I'll phrase it like this. If me and you had to jump in a car and go from Dwight, Ontario to NRC, what music would you put on and be like, this is the soundtrack to my life? This is what you need to listen to, or this is what I'm listening to right now?
Oh, I don't know. I don't listen to music in cars. It'd be a podcast.
Oh, no. Maybe I'll change it a little bit. We'll skip the car scenario. We're sitting in front of an Axiom setup. We're sitting in front of the LFR 1100s.
Yes.
With the omnidirectional. What are you putting on to be like, this is it? This is what you need to hear?
Well, I have a pretty broad range of music that I listen to. So it doesn't really matter too much the type of music. Usually what you want to do is try and use something that's recorded well. And that can be a big problem. Floyd is trying to sort of tackle that problem now with his with his whole thing about the circle of confusion. So when you're talking to him, he can fill you in on the details of that. But it's, I hope he's successful in it, because it really needs to happen. But so essentially, if you're listening to, you know, a really good recording, I don't know if it matters what the music style is. Like, I wouldn't say I have a music style that I completely dislike. I don't really listen to a lot of.
What would you listen to at home for pure enjoyment?
I would say a wide range of pop and rock and roll and jazz and folk. A real collection of that stuff, and depending on what I'm feeling like at the time, right? So as far as to narrow it down to, you know, a couple of favorites, I mean, one of my favorites I use for the double blind listen test is actually Bare Naked Ladies, the Jorden album.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's really well recorded, and it was done at Le Studio. So there's a good chance it was actually mixed on Axiom loudspeakers, because they, back then, or maybe even today, I don't know, but I don't know what happened to Le Studio. I stopped following them a long time ago, but they had Axiom speakers there for mixing on.
That is so cool. Well, with that, we'll close it off for today. Ian, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on, and take care and all the best.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun. It's great to chat about the world of audio.
Absolutely. We need to do it some more sometime in person. I want to see this crane and tower set up.
Yes, you're welcome anytime.